Hello, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Measure the Security of Software Supply Chain. I'm Kendra Morton, Product Marketing Manager at Revenera. So before we get my fellow speakers introduced, a few quick notes to make your experience today a little bit better. If you would like to submit a question, over on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a Q&A tab. Please type in your question there, and you can do that at any time throughout today's discussion. You don't have to wait till the end because we'll take questions throughout. But please note that questions are only seen by the panelists and moderators for today's webinar. Hopefully not the case, but things do happen. If you're having any technical difficulty, head on over to the chat and you can message my friend and colleague, Jacob Ward. He's the mastermind behind today's scenes, and he'll get it all sorted out for you. And finally, we have some resources under the handouts tab relevant to topics we'll go over today. Be sure to head over there before signing out and have your pick of reading material to broaden today's discussion. Okay, and with that, I'd like to welcome Lynn Westfall, software supply chain expert and consultant. She brings tons of expertise and knowledge to the topics of SBOMs and software supply chain management. Hi, Lynn.
Hi, Kendra. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, oh, of course. And joining myself and Lynn is Alex Ryback. Alex is Senior Director of Product Management at Revenera. Alex owns the thought leadership and strategic direction for our software composition analysis solutions. He also heads up Revenera's open source program office and is a member of the internal cybersecurity and incident response team. Hi, Alex.
Hey, Kendra. Hey, Lynn. Good to be here.
Yeah, as always. Okay, so let me briefly walk through today's lineup and the different topics that we're going to cover. So we're going to talk a little about Revenera's SBOM maturity assessment and how this tool will help you gauge where you're at along the SBOM maturity spectrum. After that, we'll define what an SBOM is and why SBOMs should matter to you. So why are they important? We'll then walk through some of the obstacles you may currently be facing in establishing a strategy for better understanding what's in your code or the code that comes in from external sources. Our assessment tool has provided us with insights based on what others are experiencing. So we're going to cover off on some of the relevant data that we have found as a result of that analysis. And then I will walk you through our definitions of the 3 different maturity levels, and then we'll provide you with some key takeaways from today's discussion. All right, sound good? Yeah? Okay. So what brings us here today? Revenera produced a software bill of materials maturity assessment tool. With our experience and history in helping organizations manage what's in their code and providing a complete inventory of components found in their software, we've established that there are 3 stages of maturity. The first reactive, then enabled, and optimized. And I'm going to dive more into what each of these stages mean later in our presentation. The assessment itself is a 14-question survey that dives into areas like strategic focus, SBOM construction, automation, and process integration. Based on your answers, it plugs you into one of these 3 maturity levels. Survey takers get a detailed report with a description of their designated maturity level, why they were placed where they were, as well as a list of immediate actions to take in order to improve on the maturity of their SBOM capabilities, as well as their SBOM readiness. It's a fantastic tool to help companies better understand their software supply chain and the ability to manage risk within their organization. So we've been running the assessment for a while now, and we've done an analysis on some of the data, and Alex and Lynn are going to discuss some of what we're seeing, and that's coming up. For the remainder of the presentation, we're going to dive into SBOMs, why they matter, what maturity looks like, and we'll run through some of that maturity data. And by the way, we encourage you today to take the assessment. I'm going to put a link in the chat, and I'll keep reminding you throughout. And then you can also find a link to the maturity assessment in the handout section of the webinar platform. So first thing I think we want to do is define SBOMs.
Okay, so unless people have been hiding, right? I'm sure you've heard lots of different people from lots of different contexts talk about SBOMs. So I'm going to keep this kind of high level, more of an analogy than strict definition. You can read the slide yourselves. But I always look at it as if you are baking an apple pie and you look at the ingredients list in an apple pie, right? You will see apples, you will see sugar, and then you will see this thing called dough, right? And depending on who the baker is, their recipe for the dough may be different. So an SBOM is kind of the similar thing for software, right? You have things that you need for your software to function, but the things that you need other things. And depending on where they're sourced from, you don't really have visibility into what is inside of them unless there's an analysis performed. So an SBOM is nothing more than a tool. It's a document that gives you information about what is inside your application, just like an ingredients list on an apple pie. Now, the thing you will notice if you look at the ingredients list is in parentheses next to dough, there will be a listing of what went into making that dough. So similarly, one of the most important things in the bill of material is not just the listing of parts, but the relationship between the parts. And that's important to, number one, understand how the parts were sourced and how they entered your code base and your product. But even more importantly, if something goes wrong, you need to be able to unwind that and understand where to go to get a patch, get a fix, or get guidance from the vendor that is providing that part on how to clear a licensing or a security problem. These slides are available in the handout. There's a link in the bottom right of this slide to an SBOM webinar that we did a few months back, and that goes into a lot more details if somebody is interested, and on where SBOMs came from, their level of maturity, and what's coming up in the future based on our assessment. Okay, so given that we now kind of know in general what an SBOM is, let's talk about why they're important. There's lots of angst in the industry in general about sharing SBOMs, and rightly so. If you look at what is inside of an SBOM, right, it's a listing of everything that is inside your application. So if there is a bad actor waiting to try to figure out how to exploit your product, well, you're kind of given a roadmap to that information. However, even if your company is risk averse and you don't want to share this information, there's still a ton of value in going through the work of producing one, because much like trying to manage anything, unless you list out the contents of the things that you're trying to manage, mitigate, or potentially remediate if there's problems, without that list, you really are running blind, right? You don't know what it is that's causing risk, and you don't know what it is that you have to manage. So to me, kind of the first thing, and I'm going to go through this list from a perspective of a software producer, and then Lynn will kind of take the other perspective of somebody who's buying or sourcing software. So first, impact analysis. If there is an industry event and you hear about a vulnerability, so be it Log4j or the recent curl vulnerability or the thousands of others in between those two events, the first kind of natural question is, do we have a problem? Do we use this component? So historically, absent an SBOM, the way you would do this is you would get on a call with all your VPs of engineering, you would go through all the product leaders, and you would essentially try to figure out if people are aware that a particular component is in use. So today, clearly, nobody does this anymore, or they do it in exceptional cases. So what we do is we rely on an SBOM, and perhaps it's internally scoped, meaning there's information there you're not going to publicly publish, but for your own analysis, you have a catalog or a manifest of all the different parts that you use across your applications. So impact analysis is the first kind of important thing to assess which teams may have an issue, which teams may be impacted but not exploitable potentially if it's a security problem. So that's good information to record for future. And which teams need to go through the assessment cycle to understand what it is that they have to do, whether it's upgrading a subcomponent or whether perhaps it's picking a different technology or writing some defensive code to work around an issue. But ultimately, without knowing whether you're using something or not, you're kind of running blind and you don't know whether you may be impacted or not. The second reason SBOMs matter is future-proofing and hygiene, right? If you have a catalog or a manifest of everything you're using, you can track where you've fallen out of recent releases, right? Just because something doesn't have a vulnerability and it's 5 years old, likely it is insecure, and likely nobody's been paying attention to it. If you're on a component that doesn't release frequently, there likely is not anybody kind of paying attention at the wheel as to keeping the security posture of that component up to date. So being able to burn down your technical debt, staying up to date, making sure you're not on components that are no longer maintained is kind of well supported by having a bill of material to work off of. Clearly, all these things roll into elements of application security, right? It's really hard to secure your product if you don't know what dependencies and risks are inside. And then if you kind of look downstream, your customers care, your downstream partners care, your customers' customers care. So if you're selling anything like SDKs or development kits that go into your customers' applications, if you sell directly to customers or indirectly through channels, if your technology is OEM by a downstream partner that then sells to their customers, they need to have transparency into what it is that they're getting from you, because the risk is on them having sold to their customers. And then the final thing is, I mean, there's a stick coming, right? There's mandates coming. We've all talked about them for a long time. They've been delayed to have better kind of definition and more specificity on what to do, but they are coming. There are regulations starting in December, leading into early next year, where bill of materials in some format and some level of depth are going to be required in certain sectors, especially if you're working with the US government. So even if you don't plan on sharing it, or if you don't have a strategy on how to share bill of material as an internal best practice, it's really important to come up with some sort of manifest, and ideally in a standard format so that it can be machine readable and easily shared in the future. Galen, I'll turn it over to you for the other perspective.
Right, because as a chooser, these elements are very similar. You are going to be impacted by security threats in the software that you receive. So you can be very reactive in the sense that if you don't receive SBOMs, you're kind of waiting to find out from that producer if there's a vulnerability, if there's an issue with their software. You can future-proof yourself by asking for that SBOM up front, knowing what's in that software, and you can then implement your own application security measures to track those ingredients in the software you're receiving, rather than just the main package and waiting for that producer to come out and say that something's gone wrong. Now, as a chooser, though, you also have some future proofing to get ready here, because you probably don't have a great method for ingesting and storing those SBOMs yet. You have to start preparing. Asking is the first step, right? Ask for those SBOMs, but start to work internally on what you do with those SBOMs. How do you get them to your application security team? How do you communicate that information internally? And that's going to help you create that software supply chain transparency that you're looking for as an organization, that you can communicate throughout your legal teams, your finance teams. Everyone involved in the decision-making process of software needs that SBOM data to make the educated decisions today to reduce risk within your organization. Because, surprise, your customers care. Your customers care that you're actively taking part in your software environment, not just buying software that you think will meet the need, but buying secure software, mature software, so that if you happen to interact with those governmental organizations that are going to be impacted by the mandates, or if you are in one of those industries that's going to be directly impacted by the mandates, you want to be ready. This is coming. And as we'll see coming up in the future slides, the choosers are not necessarily the ones focused on this yet. So being ready for these mandates, understanding that this SBOM data is relevant to all parts of your organization as you're making those software purchasing decisions, it's going to be critical as we start to move into this world where we are mandated to have this data regularly and control it.
Yeah, and I want to kind of jump back to the first thing Lynn said, because it's really important, is you're kind of at the mercy of your vendors, right? So if you go back to what happened with the curl vulnerability, it was reported in a blog, right, on a GitHub issue. And then there was this window of waiting, right, where on the magical Wednesday next week, we're going to not only give you the patch, but tell you which versions are impacted. So until then, everybody's vibrating because they don't know the impact, right? So at a minimum, you can at least prepare and figure out which teams use a component. Now, you may not know about the impacted versions, but at least your teams are ready and they can prep and they can schedule work when additional information is released. Otherwise, you're kind of sitting and waiting, right? And then suddenly it becomes a scramble and more of a reactive process than it should be.
So the biggest challenges that we're facing with SBOMs on both sides of the fence, really, but definitely from a chooser perspective, is going to be the format that you're receiving it in. There's going to be different formats across the industry, and Alex can speak more to the producer side on this, but from a chooser perspective, you want to start requesting these SBOMs to see the formats that you're getting to help you understand what kind of tooling you're going to need to ingest those. So formatting is still up in the air for everyone, but as things start to come together, you'll want to be prepared for what those are going to look like. And how do you trust that data that you're giving? Is it signed, and at what level? And that's even being debated, at very high levels still within CISA. Is your CEO really going to be the one signing these SBOMs as you deliver it? Or how are you going to convey that trust to the customer? How are you going to understand that trust as you receive it? And then obviously delivery is a challenge. Are you going to be emailing files back and forth? That's not going to be efficient for your customer base. As you respond or receive responses to RFPs and RFIs, are those SBOMs going to be included? Clearly, as you buy more software, you're going to have to ingest more SBOMs. So how do you scale that process? How do you scale that receipt process? And once you do receive them, bringing them into your environment and making sure that they're disseminated throughout your organization. As more and more of these come in, you'll want that process to be automated. So how do you start to work from where you are today in order to get that ingestion automated so that the right teams can do their interpretation? You're going to be looking at these SBOMs from a legal perspective, from a licensing perspective, from a security perspective, and basic tracking information perspective. So each team is going to need different parts of that SBOM information to perform their interpretation. And then, the biggest challenge of all right now, there's no teeth, there's no mandates yet. So you can ask for these SBOMs and still get that big hard no. And then it's up to your organization to make that decision. Are you going to stop purchasing software that you can't get SBOMs for? Are you going to consider that less desirable software? Does that feed into your trust of the producer if they can't provide you that SBOM until there's a mandate? Or are they willing to at least start to play ball now and help you get started?
And if you kind of flip the perspective to a producer, it's the same problems, it's just further upstream, right? So you're likely, as a software producer, not writing 100% of your software. So you're a chooser yourself, right? You are choosing which components to use. You're choosing which partners to work with. You're choosing any sort of contract developers that may be in your country, around the world, may not be well vetted, right? You typically, if you sign up with an SI partner, they're going to farm it out to their employees. Well, you likely haven't interviewed every single one of them that's going to touch your code. So it's really important to have controls in place. So kind of going back to these tiles, so format, right? If you're a software producer, produce all formats, right? Make it easy for people to consume your data. Well, your challenge is you can't control how you're going to receive that information from your upstream partners and suppliers. So you need to have tooling to either convert data or ingest multiple formats, reconcile it, normalize, and make sure that you have a canonical list of components with relationships. Trust, exact same thing, right? As a chooser, how do you trust the SBOM that came to you? Well, as a producer, how do you trust the parts of your SBOM for which you did not write the code? So kind of the same challenges, but ultimately, as a producer, you not only have to deal with how do you trust the inbound information, but also how do you convey to your customers and partners that they can trust your work. right? And that goes back to processes. So things like OpenChain, really good thing to get involved with, both from legal and security side. It's kind of a quality sticker, if you will, for processes that you run in your organization. It does help you convey more trust if you're following all of their best practices. Delivery, same thing, right? If you're looking at an application that releases once a year, delivery is not a huge problem, right? You're going to have one SBOM that sits there statically until you release a new package, except for the vulnerabilities. Well, what if you have a cloud product or SaaS native product that releases twice a day? Are you going to refresh your SBOMs every check-in? Well, if so, and that's ultimately where we all need to get to, well, how does that information flow to your thousands of tens of thousands or 100,000 of customers? And how are they notified that there's been a change, that you upgraded a component, or maybe you replaced or added a new component? So scale becomes a big problem. One tile that's missing here is kind of data currency. Right? How do you know as a supplier that you weren't owed a new SBOM 6 months ago and you have kind of a false sense of safety because you have an SBOM ingested, but there's been 5 releases since then, and maybe you didn't request it or weren't provided a new SBOM. So this whole exchange is really the biggest challenge, from kind of standards to frequency to just the mechanics of moving the data around between organizations. Interpretation also important, right? Every company has their own policies and their own level of risk. So it's not onto the producer to dictate risk. It's onto the chooser to interpret what that means to them, right? There may be vulnerabilities reported that don't impact you because you may be deploying the product in a way where it shields you from that. Or perhaps you're more exposed than the producer believes because maybe, you're in a risky industry, or maybe you're a target for bad actors out there. So you really need to look at the context of the chooser and where they operate to be able to interpret what do the results of that SBOM mean to you. And then yes, mandates for sure. That it's unlikely we're going to have agreement on a standard, right? There's 2 leading standards today. We'll get into that as part of our survey results, which are somewhat surprising. So we'll get there. But there clearly is not a camp that says we're going to do this, right? So now it becomes everyone kind of has to pick and choose. And as a producer, you don't know, right? And you're not going to know. So you really need to play nicely with everybody and make sure that you make it easy for people to accept your data at a frequency that's appropriate.
So real quick, we do have a question. What do you do if your supplier isn't able to provide you with an SBOM? You just make, I'm not sure I understand this, but known or unknown component in your SBOM. And just a comment on that from this person who's asking the question. By the way, it's not so easy to just switch suppliers.
Right. And we deal with the same thing, right? I've gone to our procurement team and, we've been working on how do we request SBOMs? Well, guess what? Most of the questions around can we get an SBOM are either what's an SBOM or no, or we're working on it, we'll reach out to you in early 2024. So that's not unexpected, right? So the other thing I would say from a producer perspective is expect that your customers will write it into contracts at some point that says you will give us one, right? That's just business terms. And if you don't give us one, then we won't do business with you, right? So it will be not only kind of best practice and regulations, but it will often be mandated by somebody who has purchasing authority and lots of sway, into which components are used and which software providers are kind of highly ranked and not so highly ranked. I don't know, Lynn, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, as a chooser, you're gonna run into this. I'm flat out. So CISA and some of the other organizations, the approach to this and the approach in the past has been to get attestation, to get some statement from your supplier that even though they're not providing this to you, that your software is free of vulnerability, or that they're doing some kind of internal scanning on their part, that they can attest that they know what's in their software, even though they're not able to provide that to you today. So you do have some, I'd say, safety net a bit in, trying those other methods if you can't get an SBOM yet. But ultimately, you want to ask for concessions. If they're not going to provide it to you at this time, commit to getting it at a later date. Get a discount on your software, get some kind of reduction in maintenance and support or ongoing subscription costs. But use this as a tool to encourage your producers that if they don't produce an SBOM, there are going to be consequences up to finding a different supplier. But there are consequences that you can give them today to not having it that will encourage them to start to build that internally.
Yeah, and also a good opportunity to kind of tighten up SLAs and agreements between you as a chooser and your software providers as to, even if they don't share an SBOM, how quickly are they obligated to act and update you if something does go wrong.
Work with your procurement and your ITAM teams on policies and yeah, absolutely. Very good.
One
Thank
more
you for your
question in the
question.
chat there. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I just said thank you for the question. Is there another one?
Yeah, and there's another question about accuracy, right? So this is a good point. So when I look at SBOMs, I kind of look at two things. Number one is accuracy, and they should always be 100% accurate, right? But there's also completeness. So SBOMs will never be 100% complete. It's impossible unless there are humans involved with updating every version of every SBOM, and that's just resource-wise not feasible. So there's always going to be risk-reward, cost-benefit analysis by the producer on how much they're willing to put into it, and the chooser on how much unknown they're willing to accept. Now, the thing that is missing, right, if you kind of go back to the SBOM definition, there's some really basic information about who produced SBOM, what tooling did they use to produce it, right? And the tooling is nothing more than a string that says, application foo was used to produce an SBOM. What's missing and what we put into our SBOMs is what was the level of analysis that went into the results of the tool, right? Most tools out there today have options on how deep do you scan, how many levels of dependencies do you go through, do you include any kind of things that are lower level than components, any sort of fragments of code, copy paste, do you describe the services you rely on, right? So there's lots of SBOM parts that go beyond top level components that are declared in manifest files. And that's another thing that you really need to demand as a chooser is some sort of agreement on understanding what level of analysis your vendor went through. So then you can know how much you trust it, right? Nothing's going to be 100% complete, but you really need to push for 100% accuracy, which means ideally no false positives and an understanding of where false negatives may occur, right? That the analysis just wasn't done to a certain level. So you're accepting the risk that you may only know about components, you don't know about fragments or lines of code, and that may be okay for you because you're not ready to get that level of detail yet. Okay, so with that being said, let's jump into the results. I think, Lynn, you got the first one.
Yeah, so interesting results here about what the responders' role within their organizations were. And I don't necessarily think this is surprising that we're seeing, heavily engineering response here. You're producing software, you're aware there's mandates coming, so you're interested in this topic more than necessarily your IT departments, your legal departments. But we're seeing this also other group that could include IT procurement, ITAM, and other roles within the organization. So right now, yep, the focus is definitely on security and engineering and those people that are actively involved in protecting the organization from threats, or they're actively developing the software that they're going to sell to customers and need to be on that topic. But I think we'll see this evolve as the mandates come in. I think we'll definitely see that legal bulk up. I think in some of the other group, you might be seeing finance and accounting people that are curious how this is going to impact the organization's purchasing of software and overall budgets. So the main thing here, I think the takeaway is that there are many roles within the organization that are going to be impacted. And if you are in a role that is very aware of this and there are areas of your business that aren't aware yet of how they're going to be impacted, disseminate that information within your organization, get it out there, and make sure that everyone is on the same page about how your organization is going to start to produce or ingest SBOMs, or both, depending upon your organization and role.
Yeah, I think my one kind of takeaway from this is if you look at the results, there's about a third of the stakeholders that are non-technical, or we assume the other bucket is going to be non-technical. So that really means that annotation and roll-up of data is really important, right? You're not going to be in the weeds on component level. People outside of legal security engineering are going to want to know kind of aggregate risk, maybe which products in the company have more risk than others. So maybe they can reshuffle resources, budgets, timelines, planning, and so forth. So it's not enough just to throw the data over the wall. You need tooling to have dashboards, to have kind of some sort of boiled down so what, right? And that information becomes more important when you get out of the engineering teams and get into management and legal and purchasing and finance and so forth, because they're going to have to make business decisions going forward based on the risk that they're incurring from these SBOMs. Okay, the second question that is very relevant is about how do you go about cataloging third-party content, right? So this is pretty shocking. 68% of the replies ultimately do not scan their applications, right? Either they rely on disclosures only, which is about 41%, meaning we trust and hopefully we spot check and verify here and there, but ultimately we rely on trust, and others just don't, right? So we have about 68% that ultimately are hoping that things work out. Only 5% of the replies go to anything below or kind of beyond manifest file declarations, which for today's, okay, right, the market for the most part is still trying to figure out how do we at least get the big rocks? Like how do we get onto a consistent cadence of trustworthy data that's updated regularly, that represents the obvious things that you could look at if you're an engineer, but are not apparent to you if you get a binary from us, right? So that's kind of phase one, right? Then phase two becomes, well, how do we go deeper and how do we automate more of what traditionally has required humans? But the fact that we've got, almost 7 out of 10 people that either don't scan or don't do anything is something that has to change over time, right? So, but that's where it's at today. And this is across both software producers that answer the questionnaires as well as choosers, right? So we're not just talking about people buying software, we're talking about organizations that build software but still don't heavily invest in the discovery process.
So this next,
I'm sorry, real quick. There's another question. I apologize, Lynn. There's another question in the Q&A. Let's get to that. Will you expect SBOMs to include structured info? Our software consists, this is an example, our software consists of component A and B, and component A consists of D and E, plus component B consists of F and G, blah, blah, blah. Or would it be enough to say in our SBOM, or in the SBOM, our software consists of components A, B, D, and F, and G. Minimum SBOM regs don't say anything about it.
Well, this kind of goes to speaking to the format. So depending on the SBOM you receive, like SPDX format is very focused on relationship, where Cyclone DX is going to be much more focused on the components. And really, I mean, it sounds sort of more, you're looking at this from the ingestion perspective, from the receiver perspective. Are you concerned about if a software package has a transitive dependency that has a vulnerability in it versus a direct dependency? Not necessarily. If it has a vulnerability, it has the vulnerability. So it's going to kind of be up to your organization to determine what's important to you in the SBOM and how you want it to be sort of interpreted and understood. And then, Alex, if you can speak more to the producer side and how you would look at that.
Yeah, I think the answer to this question, it depends on which side of the lens you're looking from. So first of all, the SBOM requirements do talk about this because relationships are a mandatory field. Now, that doesn't mean it gets filled in, right? There's cases where relationship is unknown and everything is kind of just a flat list, right? I would say from a chooser side, so if you're buying software, it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, you're going to go back to your vendor and you're going to expect them to fix it and give you an update that addresses the problem. If you are a producer, you absolutely have to know, because where do you go to make the change? You're the one who has to make the change. So it's really important for you to understand if there's a vulnerability in some low-level deep transitive component, how do they make it into your code, right? Is it a dependency that is actually required by your code? Is it kind of an orphan dependency that is a false positive and doesn't matter? Is it something that's not reachable, although it's vulnerable? So from a producer perspective, you absolutely have to have all the relationships and understand how you sourced it. From a chooser or buyer perspective, you just need to know it's kind of a binary analysis. There's a problem with this thing. A vendor, give me a patch, right? But at least I know that I'm impacted now. I kind of have to hold your feet to the fire on that.
All right. So getting back to the slide and the results, who owns the management of open source and third-party component use within your organization? So sadly here, another third of respondents didn't know. And that's, something that if your organization still doesn't know, this is the time. Things are coming. You want to make that change to figure it out. And we had a good number of respondents here that had an OSPO or an open source policy office that was responsible for that. And that is, I think, more of a mature organization that's preparing for these mandates, or was prepared from a perspective previously of confirming their open source materials within their products. But again, here primarily we're seeing that engineering is taking on the brunt of this responsibility to generate those SBOMs, because they're the ones that are taking on most of these third-party components, and they are kind of the hands-on, the ones in there the most. So I think from a perspective of a chooser, you want to know within your organization those critical departments that should be involved, that do own this process, but maybe it's not connected yet. So I think bringing that together within your organization, if you don't know, it's time to figure it out.
Yeah, and I really point to kind of the second bullet on the right there. So engineering from a producer perspective is responsible about a third of the time. Not clear from a chooser, likely it's going to be procurement or ITAM or somebody who's not in a development role. Education is really important, right? If you're a developer who never learned any of this when you were in school, right? Now there's all this accountability being pushed on you. You got to make sure you train your teams on kind of open source basics, licensing, security best practices, remediation best practices, making sure that when you fix one thing, you're not breaking another. So all of these things need to be kind of pushed into engineering teams. And if you are on the chooser side and you're receiving SBOMs, you're likely going to have no idea what they mean, right? You're going to need some sort of training or tooling or reporting that tells you what is a good or bad. And if it's bad, how bad, and what are your options to deal with it, right? So you can't just assume people will figure out what to do with it. There's got to be some training investment to make sure people are prepared to deal with this stuff. And there's a comment by person who asked the question about the SBOM, right? Yes, for sure, there may be multiple versions of SBOMs released internally and externally. There may be another version to your downstream partners that aren't customers, right? So yes, there could be many flavors of SBOMs as far as depth, as far as how many additional fields are in the SBOM for more context that may not be relevant to a chooser, but definitely relevant to a technical resource that can fix the problem. So yes, it's not a one size fits all for sure.
And internally, you might be creating development level SBOMs, at different parts of your process, so that you're kind of point checking yourself. And that's information you may not want to disseminate when you're producing a final SBOM.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about format. So this is not a pie chart, mainly because it was a multi-select. So we decided to kind of visualize it differently. But this is pretty astonishing here. So the two kind of most popular and most talked about formats in this industry are SPDX and CycloneDX. They're kind of methodology-wise different, right? SPDX is more of a bottom-up kind of file-level licensing history of the format, whereas CycloneDX is more of a top-down component security perspective. There is a new version of SPDX, version 3.0, coming out, which makes a pretty significant leap forward to kind of get closer on par with CycloneDX and the various contexts that it supports. But only 23% of the respondents checked off one of those two. right? So 41% is SWID, or software ID tags, right? So my guess is there is kind of legacy data being repurposed for SBOM purposes, right? So software ID tags are things that were relied upon in software asset management and security tools, right? It holds software metadata. It was kind of a low-hanging fruit way to catalog, tag, and understand what a piece of software means definition-wise. This kind of predated these other formats. So SPDX and CycloneDX were specially purposed for software composition disclosure. And therefore, maybe there's organizations that already had software ID tag data and they just chose to kind of run with it. But the fact that, again, there's only 23% of the answers that are sticking to what today are the two leading formats means that most of the people are either still in spreadsheet world or PDF world, which is very scary, or simply don't know. A quarter of the people have no idea, right? So again, as a software producer, you want to be friendly with everybody, right? You don't want to block any of your customers from receiving, ingesting, and understanding your data. As a chooser, you need to put pressure on your providers on what formats you want to receive data in. And hopefully, at least the choice is pick one of the first two, right? Pick SPDX or CycloneDX and anything else you want, right? Maybe human readable is better in a spreadsheet, but you definitely want formats that can be machine readable, scalable, and ingested programmatically and not require somebody to eyeball through a list in a PDF document.
Yeah, even from a chooser perspective, if you're still managing at the spreadsheet level, it's not going to be maintainable, and that information is manually massaged at every other level then when you're getting it to your security teams or anywhere else. So it's important to think now about what formatting you'd prefer and that you can easily just move around within your organization. So that speaks to this next response. What do you do with the SBOMs you get or construct? How do you store them? So speaking to the last slide, if you're still storing them in Excel or you're still receiving PDFs and this is all you're getting, you might be storing this on a network share somewhere and thinking, yeah, you're good to go. But as we move into a more mature state with these mandates, the 75% of the respondents that don't do anything with them today or don't know what they're doing with them or just stick them on that file system, that's a major chunk of the respondents here that don't have a way to automate this process as it starts to become mandated and part of our everyday integrated environment. If you don't have any kind of system for ingesting them that creates ease within your organization, this is going to become burdensome really quickly. The more you have to generate them to meet your customer demands, the more you have to ingest them to meet your internal demands. If you continue on this manual route, you're going to run into a wall. And this is really the time that you have now to determine, okay, what kind of system will work for us? How do I integrate that with the existing systems I have today? If you're an ITAM professional or an IT procurement, you might have asset management tools that could potentially ingest these, but they may not take all formats. They may not be able to translate that information into other areas of the business as you need. So it's important to look at the tooling that you have and figure out where those gaps are. And if you don't have anything today, if you're part of that 75%, it's time to start looking and figure out what that landscape looks like for your organization.
Yeah, I'd say if you're the 36% that don't know, please go find out, right? Number one, find out whom to ask, which is probably going to be the hardest thing. And then try to find out because you need to know, right? You're going to be impacted with it. I'm glad to see that we're almost to a fifth of the answers that people actively do something with it. So that's great. I kind of have a little bit of a different take to the ones that either do nothing or just store them, that at least you're asking for them. So that's a good thing, right? So to me, there's kind of two parts, right? One is you definitely want to get the data so you can figure out your ingestion process, your tooling, and how you're going to do this. But there's also the other side of the house, which is at least ask, even if you don't do anything with them, just get in the habit of receiving them, updating them, and then along with that, kind of figure out what your process is going to be to actually make them work for you. Because the other thing you don't want to do is you don't want to have all the tooling in place and be getting no data, right? So it requires both, and there may be different people in your organization that receive and receive these things, and another team maybe that processes them and puts them somewhere where they could be queried, rolled up, there's dashboards, reports, alerts, and so forth.
Well, that just made me think about even on the construct side, you may have multiple teams within your organization constructing, especially if you are a company that grows a lot through acquisition. You probably have multiple development teams out there constructing SBOMs, and they may be storing them on their own. They may be out in multiple different formats. So as an organization, look to bring that together as well.
Okay, and clearly we can't do this without a Log4j question. So we had a Log4j question, and it was interesting, right? So first of all, 18% of the people don't use Java. So great, you weren't impacted by Log4j. So there's about 3,000 others that potentially impacted you. The other was kind of interesting because number one, a little over a third don't know, which I find kind of interesting because I know at least in our company, everybody knew, right? Log4j was significant. Even if it didn't bring the company to a grinding halt, it certainly woke everybody up. And lots of people were asked questions. We had to deal with external communication. If you have multiple business units, you have to coordinate, make sure you're consistent in your outside messaging. Everybody went through and had to kind of double check their processes, whether they had them or not, or maybe you're the one where it was not disruptive. That's great. Like you should be very outspoken about what you did so others can learn from your process. But ultimately, it was a pretty even split. Except again, the don't know is pretty amazing to me. I looked at Log4j as kind of a really kind of good event for just taking a pulse on where you are as a company and how you dealt with it, right? There's the tooling side of it, but there's also the process side, right? Do you have documentation on what process you follow if something like this happens, right? Who's running point of communication, who's coordinating, the dozens of product teams that all have to put all their information into a table. What about your tooling? What if you have different levels of depth of analysis team to team, right? All of these things really need to get flushed out every time this happens. So I'd kind of ask the second question, which happened after the survey, which is, well, how did curl go for you? Right? Because curl was kind of the next one. And was it better than Log4j? And if the answer is you were impacted by both, but it wasn't better, then you need to go back and look again.
Yeah, certainly if you didn't make any organizational changes at that point, if you weren't in the 18% of not disruptive, that would be very surprising. I think most organizations saw this as a bit of a wake-up call, and we need to improve our processes. And hopefully, if you're not scanning, getting back to one of the earlier questions, you started to implement some kind of scanning method.
Okay, so that concludes all of the questions we wanted to highlight. I'll turn it over to Kendra to kind of walk through the buckets you ended up in if you took the survey and what they mean.
Okay, so what we're going to try to do now is really better understand these three levels of maturity that we keep talking about. And yes, this is a bit of an eye chart. Apologize about that. But what we did try to do was summarize what each stage of maturity basically looks like. And then we tried to boil it down into more consumable nuggets just for the purposes of this discussion. So if you're reactive, you're in that reactive box, you've got some general awareness of what's happening with emerging security regulations, but SBOM management really hasn't taken on any kind of strategic focus and probably really requires a lot of manual construction as opposed to having the right tools or the right processes for continuous automation. This results in the inability to continuously assess and retain kind of real tangible insight into your software supply chain as well as your compliance risk. If you're in this reactive bucket, you're using software that other companies are creating, but probably you don't have the ability to import third-party SBOMs into a system that enables you to manage related risk, as well as to act on verifiable SBOM data. And finally, your remediation efforts are mostly manual, and they probably take a lot of extra time because you lack the ability to consume, to verify, and to share provenance data both within and outside your organization. So far, our data tells us that most of the organizations that took our survey are falling into this category. 73% of our survey responders are reactive. So then as we jump and move over to the enabled level, if you find yourself enabled, SBOM management has started to take on a more strategic focus, but you really might still be deciding where in the organization this resides or who owns it. When it comes to transparency of SBOMs, it's probably a high priority for you, and you continuously work to approach it in a way that meets not just the needs of your business, but also the needs of your customers as well. You're now probably more consistently producing SBOMs, and you're working toward achieving a more integrated, a more automated approach to SBOM creation. And with some manual effort, you're able to work security remediation into your existing SDLC process. You are either actively working with upstream partners to obtain SBOMs for the code that you use. And if you're not actively working with them, you're certainly aware of how important this step is. And you're also becoming a more active participant in industry events, work groups, and forums that focus on SBOM management. And you're probably building your knowledge base, right? We talk about, we've talked about in this webinar some of the standards and what's going on with some of the mandates and where they reside. So you're building that knowledge base on industry standards and best practices. From our survey results, 27% of respondents were enabled. And then moving on to our third and final maturity level, and that's optimized. So you'll see that not a lot of respondents, or I'm sorry, no respondents were in the optimized for SBOM management, and really not surprised by that. And I'll give you that list of kind of what you need to be doing in order to fall into this bucket. So your organization has assigned responsibility for supply chain security, and as well as SBOMs are a large part of your business strategy for both security as well as compliance risk mitigation. You have an automated and scalable SDLC process in place, and it is tied to your DevSecOps pipelines. And SBOMs for the applications you build are up to date and also include SBOM parts from outside your company as well. And you're more than likely actively engaged in a regular update cadence. SBOMs are complemented with security reports that explain your application's security posture, and you're probably doing that at any given point in time. You're able to immediately respond to external requests from customers and downstream partners for SBOMs, or you may even be able to provide self-service capabilities. You're also optimized to quickly respond to remediating security vulnerabilities. We look at organizations in the optimized level as leaders in SBOM management, given that you are more than likely an active participant in those industry work groups I talked about, and you're probably responding to requests for industry feedback that are helping to help others move forward. It's helping to drive standards and best practices. So you're very actively engaged in the community. So as I said, to date, no survey respondents are in are optimized for SBOM management, and we're not really surprised by that. As you know, we've talked about before, the industry is really still learning about SBOMs and why they're important. As much as it is a global effort, there will be a time when mandates from government and industry groups will require companies to catch up and catch up pretty quickly. So that's why this assessment tool is pretty handy for companies to gauge where they're at and any next steps needed to prepare them for what's ahead.
Yeah, and a couple kind of quick thoughts. We did have a few folks that were kind of right on the line there between enable and optimized. And to me, the last two bullets of optimized are really the most difficult ones, right? Because this can't be a push, right? It can't be a push and it can't be a pull. It has to be combined, right? You can't have somebody asking every morning, give me a new SBOM. And you can't be flooding somebody's inbox with an SBOM as an attachment to email. So you have to be connected, right? You have to have some sort of tooling plugged into your, supplier has to have tooling in their build system that pushes data to a buyer, and it just continuously updates, right? So that's really the second to last bullet is self-service. Whenever you care, you just log in and you get information. You don't have to go ask somebody to provide it to you. And then, anytime you are on these calls with CISA or SPDX work group or others, there's, about 10 people in the world that are actively engaging, right? There's a lot of people listening. There's people who kind of jump in here and there, myself included. But there's really a very small number of people that are really moving the needle, kind of driving the bus on this thing. And that's kind of really what you need to be doing to end up in the optimized bucket, along with, things that just are not possible yet because we're not there yet as an industry with standards and tooling.
Yep. Very good. Thank you, Alex. All right, we're going to move on to our key takeaways. We've got just a few minutes, so let's try to get these because I think they're important.
Yeah, and I think number one is get engaged with the community. The CISA SBOM work groups are open to anyone who wants to join. There's like one a day if you're really interested in hopping onto them. And like Alex said, it's not a large group. The last week of calls have had like 30 to 35 people, but there's really only 4 or 5 people speaking on these calls, really actively engaging. So even if you just start lurking to get in these groups and to understand what the discussions are, it's going to help you to understand how to mature your organization and your processes better.
Yeah. Second one is policies, training, roles, responsibilities, right? Figure it out for your company. A really good way to do this again is, go look at the OpenChain conformance questionnaire. It'll give you great kind of steps to take and documentation to produce to be OpenChain conformant. And that checks the box on making sure that everybody in your company is enabled to start doing these things.
And then if you're not constructing SBOMs today, you've got to start. There are hundreds of open source tools available. There are lots of different ways to start scanning your information. Get out of those manual processes. Agree on what formatting you're going to use, how you're going to update that as you update components, how deeply you want to connect those relationships. Start making those decisions and just start getting them out there and getting feedback from at least internally within your organization about what you're producing and the quality and how you're going to continue to move that maturity level into being fully automated.
Yeah, and although not every company sells software, every company buys software. So work with your procurement folks, agree on processes, agree on how you're going to ask what formats, what are you going to do with them, and then communicate that to your vendors so they know what you expect of them and what maybe you will write into contracts in the future.
And then finally, complete the SBOM assessment tool. Yes, to be counted. Yep, we certainly want that, but also you'll learn something, right? And we've said there is, as much as there are no real mandates currently in place, they are coming. And through that SBOM assessment tool, you're going to learn more about yourself as an organization, what you're doing, how you're doing it, and get some valuable feedback on what you should be doing to kind of move up into those maturity levels so that you're prepared for when those mandates do hit. So that's really important. Okay. All right, we're at the end of our time. Alex and Lynn, thank you so much. I think this was great. A lot of really good information. So thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Yeah. All right.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
everyone. Have a great day.